Dan Lewis here again. We are now beginning lecture number 8. In our lecture so far, we've talked about languages, we've talked about texts, we've talked about the history of the English Bible, we've talked a little bit about textual criticism, and then we spent some sessions on translation theory. In this lecture and the next one, we are going to talk about the canon of the Bible, the Old Testament canon and the New Testament canon. When we use a word like canon, we are using a word that describes those books of the Bible which are considered to be scripture as opposed to those that are not. Books that are considered to be scripture are the rule of faith, and the word canon basically is a word very much like the word rule. It's a measurement or a criteria by which we evaluate the books. In this lecture, we want to look especially at the Old Testament, and we want to look beginning with the Hebrew Bible. Now, as you look at the slide before you, you'll notice that the arrangement of books in the Hebrew Bible is going to be different than the arrangement that you are probably used to seeing in the English Bible. The Hebrew Bible has 3 sections, which are called the Law, the Prophets, and the Writings, or the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketubim. In these books, the arrangements are the same for the Torah, but then when you get to the prophets, you will notice that there is a book called the 12 at the very end of the latter prophets. For most of us, we call these the minor prophets, but in the Hebrew Bible, this is a single scroll. And you'll also notice that there are 4 or 5 places where there is a red asterisk behind some of the books. These are books that in the Hebrew Bible originally were a single scroll, and then later they were divided into 2 scrolls. So we have 1st and 2nd Samuel in the English Bible, 1st and 2nd Kings in the English Bible, and so forth, whereas in the Hebrew Bible it was just Kings and Chronicles. When we talk about the canon of the Hebrew Bible, then we need to talk about these 3 sections because this is the way the Hebrew Bible was arranged. The 24 books of the Hebrew Bible are, in fact, exactly the same as the 39 books of the Old Testament in the English Bible, except that the fact, of course, is that some of them were combined because they occurred in single scrolls. But if you split up Samuel, you split up Kings, you split up the 12, you split up Ezra and Nehemiah, you split up Chronicles, you will find that you will come up with the 39 books that are in the English Old Testament. When we talk about the fixing of the canon, we need to start with the very first mention of these 3 sections of the Hebrew Bible, the Law, the Prophets, and the other books. And this was made in about 132 BC by a Jewish scholar and scribe by the name of Ben Sira. And in his translation of Sirach, he spoke of these 3 sections. The fact that he spoke of them at this early period, 132 BC, means that they were identifiable at that early period of time. In fact, the first 2 collections, the Law and the Prophets, seem to be clearly identifiable as fixed well before the time of Jesus. We believe this because Jesus himself used this expression, the Law and the Prophets. And so did St. Paul. He speaks of the Law and the Prophets. Because they speak of that, that seems to suggest then that these 2 sections of the Hebrew Bible are agreed upon. Jesus also spoke of the Law, the Prophets, and the Psalms. And if you look back at the previous slide, you will notice that the Psalms is the first long section of the first book in the 3rd section of the Hebrew Bible. And so it's quite probable that when Jesus said the Law and the Prophets and the Psalms, he was in fact referring to these 3 sections of the Hebrew Bible. In Flavius Josephus, who was a 1st century Jewish historian, Josephus speaks of 22 books in the Hebrew Bible. Now, we don't know why he says 22 rather than 24, but it is at least apparent that since he says as many as 22, the books of the first 2 sections are fixed and the books of the 3rd section are perhaps somewhat ambiguous. In any case, the threefold division of the Hebrew Bible clearly seems to be well before the time of Jesus. Now, an important physical factor in this canonical process is that the biblical scriptures of the Old Testament are encoded on separate scrolls. There's a scroll for Isaiah, there's a scroll for Ezekiel, there's a scroll for Exodus, and so forth. And the fact that these are individual scrolls means that the idea of canon is less well formed because these books all exist as independent units. Later, in the Christian era, books began to be bound into a codex like a book. So they're bound on one edge, and they're bound together. And as soon as you put books into a codex with a front cover and a back cover, implicitly, you've suggested some kind of canon, some kind of decision-making process as to what books go between those covers. Prior to that time, however, there was a lot more ambiguity about that. And some of that ambiguity remains for that third section. Certainly there were a lot of writings produced by the Jews in the intertestamental period, some of them nearly as old as the Old Testament, and some of them right up into the time of the New Testament. But most of those writings do not appear in the canon of Scripture. There were many more writings than there were accepted as Scripture itself. One of the disadvantages we have is that prior to the Christian era, there is no canon list of the books of the Old Testament. Even though Flavius Josephus in the first century said there were 22 books that were sacred to the Jews, unfortunately, he gives the number of books, but he doesn't name them. So we don't know exactly which books he included, and no canon list exists from that early period of time. And that means that there remains some ambiguity about the writings. This third collection with several unresolved questions. One of the questions is, why did the translators of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, why did they include the so-called apocryphal books? Books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, or books like Tobit or Judith, or the Prayer of Manasseh. We don't know the answer to that. Another question, why did Josephus list only 22 books? We don't know the answer to that. If you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls that came from the Qumran community, you'll discover that in addition to the 150 Psalms that we have in our English Bible, they actually had 15 more. And they're right alongside the Psalms that we're used to seeing in our Bible. Why did they have these extra 15 Psalms? Well, we don't know the answer to that. And why did survivors of the first Jewish revolt, which happened in AD 70, why did they re-examine the issue of canon at Yavne? This was after the fall of Jerusalem. If the question was already settled, why would they re-examine the question later? And we don't know the answer to that. So in the end, we've got a number of questions that are unresolved about this third section. Why, for instance, did writers in the New Testament sometimes cite passages from books that were outside the 24? But in fact, we know that they did. The book of Jude, for instance, cites a passage from the Pseudepigrapha. And the letter to the Romans, Paul cites the Wisdom of Solomon, one of the books in the Apocrypha. So from the Old Testament period then, there is going to actually exist two canons, and different groups are going to support one or the other. There is the canon that is accepted by Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox Church, and then there is another canon that's accepted by Protestants and Jews. All of them accept the Torah. All of them accept the prophets. All of them accept the writings. But once you get to the writings, the Protestant and Jewish canon ends. But the Catholic and Orthodox canon extends, because it also includes the apocryphal books, which, even though they're slightly different in the Eastern Church than the Catholic Church, they are basically the same set of books. And in the Roman Catholic Church, these are called the deuterocanonical books and are accepted as Scripture. They do not, however, appear in most Protestant Bibles, although there are some exceptions to that. The first roughly century of the King James Version had the apocryphal books printed in them, and there are some other versions, such as the Revised Standard Version and other versions that may also print apocryphal books. So that brings us to the end of the Old Testament canon, and what that basically means as we come to the conclusion of that is that we are all agreed on the books of the Torah, we are all agreed on the books of the prophets, we're all agreed on the books of the writings, but then when we come to those extra books called the apocryphal books, there is disagreement between the Roman and Orthodox communities on one hand and the Protestant Jewish communities on the other. And this ends Lecture 8.